Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joel Kibazo, and we're here to discuss, at least in news terms, the real Africa. And the topic is sort of fairly appropriate, given that quite a number of us, at least all of us on the panel, are here in London to judge the CNN Multi-Choice Journalist of the Year Awards. That has been going for some sort of 13 years or so. And just to sort of set the context, I was thinking that sort of if we're looking at the real Africa, you have Morocco, Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, Angola, Zimbabwe, my own country of Uganda, Madagascar. So basically you talk about sort of some 53 independent nations that make up the African continent. It is big and it is diverse. And yet, in spite of that, if you look at things through the Western media, what appears to come through are the same issues and the same stories. Zimbabwe, the crisis in Darfur, the wars in Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. There appears to be little mention, except on sort of one or two occasions, of the Africa of spectacular mobile phone growth, the boom in private radio and television stations that has brought diversity to the media landscape and opened up the channels of communications, or even the new generation of African bankers, stockbrokers that are reshaping the continent's financial sector. And so, which is the real Africa? The question sort of that arises. Is it the first one, or is it the second one, or even is it a combination of the two? And for many of us, should we actually even care how Africa is reported in the Western media? Is it important that Africa is reported in a particular way? Now, those are just some of the areas we're hoping in the ground we hope to cover this evening. I'm not going to be the one doing the talking, but it's going to be my three colleagues up here on the platform. And just sort of going from left to right, we have Azubuike Ishekweni, who is the Executive Director of Publications at Punch newspaper in Nigeria. Then we have Brahima Udrego, who's a senior reporter at Radio Burkina in Burkina Faso. And to my right is Ferial Haffajee, who's the editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian newspaper in South Africa. And I mentioned that we're here that many of us are here also judging the CNN Africa Journalist of the Year Awards. And within the audience are some of our colleagues who are coming from time to time. So there's Alinda Lopez from Mozambique, Secretary of Saba, and Sophie Lesso of Oxfam, who's from Senegal. There's Anna Mbima from here in the UK, and Kim Nogar, who's the CNN Bureau Chief in Johannesburg. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for a few moments to lay out what they see as the real Africa, and to really sort of start us off in terms of the reportage that they see coming through the media, the Western media, for want of a better term, and to see if their perspective sort of arises. So I'm going to start with Ferial to ask, does it matter? Is the Western perspective the perspective on Africa? Or, for instance, in your newsroom, what is it you're asking your reporters to do? Are they the same stories or are they different? Sure. Okay. So, Ferial.
I'm always horribly discomforted by topics which are sit like tonight's, because I think there's an assumption that journalists in Africa need to tell the good story, that there isn't a universal declaration of rights, and that there isn't a universal journalism. And for me, there definitely is, but I do think that there are some stories which journalists in the North miss, and I think miss to their own detriment, to give a fair perspective on a growing continent. But like you, we are very, very concerned about both Zimbabwe and about Kenya, and about the backtracking of democracy in both those countries in 2008. They have been the ones, unfortunately, which hogged the headlines when I had hoped that a country like Botswana might do so. It had a very peaceful inauguration of what seems to be a very good African leader, a next generation leader. Obviously, we're still concerned about a fracturing peace in the Sudan, about Darfur, and about where on earth Joseph Kony might be in the north of Uganda. Many of you spent hours or days waiting for him to come out of the bush, and he didn't. In my own country, I am extremely worried about Jacob Zuma's coming presidency, although I see that he seems to have charmed the pants of many of you on a trip through London a couple of weeks ago. And like you, we're watching with great interest the ways in which China and India are fundamentally resculpting the geopolitics of Africa. What might it mean? This week, though, I thought I'd take you on a whip around of what's making African journalists think, if you to consider the CNN entries as a kind of microscope or telescope into African journalism. And two particular quotes which I absolutely loved. The first from my colleague Azuya, where he, quoting the former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo, said, at his home is apparently the sign, no dogs or journalists allowed. This is at his farm. And then there's another one. It wasn't about journalism, but I think it's often apt for the way we're treated. Like a tsetse fly on the scrotum of the nation. So what have I seen this week? And these are the stories which I think you're missing, or not you, but I think journalists in the North may often be missing. I think we're seeing a massive improvement in the quality of journalism across our continent. Radio, television, all sounding and looking a lot better. Professional design of newspapers, who are really serving the ends of a fourth estate very, very proudly. Journalists still in jail, like colleagues in Eritrea and Ethiopia, and in many other parts of our continent, which I think must be the campaign of you and also importantly of all of us. I see people breaking taboos and probing cultural boundaries everywhere. There was a wonderful breast cancer campaign in Kenya, which really, I think, did push the envelope significantly. And we listened today to a most charming piece of a Zambian journalist who had himself circumcised and then told the painful story step by step. I promise. I hope you'll get to hear it sometime. Like I said, it's not in our entries, but I do think the story of Botswana, the inauguration of Ian Khama there, is one that's worth looking at. There's the resculpting of the diamond industry, where beneficiation will take place in that country. And I think that's a real altering of North-South trade relations, which is a good story to tell, because it's changing things. It's locating our economies back where they belong. I think the story of the ship, which has kept us all fixed to our television screens, has been a wonderful good news story about people-to-people solidarity, about civil society working with international trade unions, working with international NGOs, and some sympathetic governments to ensure that those awful weapons weren't allowed to be offloaded and used against the people of Zimbabwe. Lovely stories today about the fact that in Zimbabwe, ARVs, those life-saving AIDS drugs, now cost double what a junior doctor might get paid. They're therefore out of the reach of most people who need them. There's interesting stories we've read about the ways in which a male circumcision may be a very good way of preventing the spread of AIDS, which of course has shown itself to be quite impermeable to billions of dollars of campaigns. A simple snip, maybe not so simple, according to some of what we saw. We heard today about Swaziland's Circumcision Sundays, where they're trying to make it a mass-based prevention campaign. And I can see you closing your legs there. Okay, a couple more that really caught my eye. There were wonderful stories of resilience, survival, and solidarity. In Kenya, teachers who are taking the little they've got to ensure that the young orphans who are living in child-headed households have something to eat as they learn. I particularly looked for but didn't find stories on how remittances are increasingly bolstering African economies. They now outstrip foreign aid payments, and for me that's really something to watch and to encourage in many ways. And then just finally, two things which really made us smile. The number of green entries or environmental ones has grown substantially, and the quality thereof saw us battling for several hours today to award the finest piece of work. So that was extremely important to watch. And then finally, a young man with a prosthetic leg who is planning to get into the Olympics, and it seems to us like if it's spirit alone which fuels him, he's going to be there later this year, although many other people might not. So those are the stories which we've been seeing. They really do lift your spirits but also dampen them sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ferial. Azu, how do you see things from sort of the Nigerian perspective? You know, is the reporting fair, for want of a better term? Is the Western reporting what it should be of our continent? And what are the stories that publications like yours, Punch in Lagos and Nigeria, are looking at?
I think, thank you very much, Joel. I think Ferial has given a very nice summary of what represents our hopes and aspirations. Last year, I was here, and the hot topic last year, about this time last year, was the Nigerian elections. And the hot topic this year, obviously, is the election in Kenya, and of course the ongoing crisis in Zimbabwe. But I think that my first instinct when I got this invitation to come back again and talk about the covering or reporting of Africa was, look, does it really matter? Which was one of the points you addressed. Because the World Bank, not that it's not important as a piece of news, but I have been asking myself, and this is the message that we discuss often in the newsroom, are we just going to sit back and say, look, so how are we going to be reported by the West? I think we, as journalists, and we're doing a lot of this in the Punch, last year we said to ourselves, there's a lot going on in the West African sub-region that is not covered in the newspapers in the sub-region. What can we do to cover those stories ourselves? There is a mistake that we often make, and when I say we, I speak not just only about journalists in Nigeria and in Africa and perhaps in other parts of the world. We tend often to follow the politicians. And following the politicians all of the time can end you in a ditch, and we have learned our lessons. So I'm asking myself as a journalist, because I have a strong sense that the future of the continent, from what we have seen so far, probably does not lie with the big politicians that we've all been looking up to. And I'm sure that Africans have had their share of disappointments, as perhaps people in other parts of the world. And so I encourage journalists in the Punch to cover a lot more of what is happening. How are people getting on with their normal lives, you know, how are people dealing with the issues of power supply, how are they dealing with the issues of water, how are they dealing with the issues of infrastructure. And I don't think that there is any special code of reporting this story that is unique only to journalists in Nigeria. But I think what we need to do a lot more, the World Bank has said that, look, in 2008, the African economy will be doing perhaps 6.5 or 6.7. But we need, as journalists, to go into the details. How is the monies that we are getting in an oil-rich country, for example, like Nigeria, how is the money being spent? Now, that question is not going to be asked by Western journalists. It's important for me as a journalist based in Nigeria to ask that question, perhaps as much as journalists elsewhere. There's also the point that, a very important point that Ferial made about the engagement of the East. Right now in Nigeria, there are about between, say, 25,000, 30,000 Indians. And the volume of business, the volume of trade between Nigeria and India is grown gradually over the years. Right now stands about between $3.4, $3.5 billion a year, and it's almost the same range with China. So people are asking themselves, well, if we're having frustrations or challenges or issues, people are also looking elsewhere, and the story also is not just about how we cover ourselves, but people are finding ways to deal with situations of their normal living in terms of how other continents, how people in other parts of the world also engage us. So I think for me, I'm not really, I'm not saying that if there are issues that we need to deal with, we should ignore them. But I think that there's a real danger as journalists, whether as Nigerian journalists or journalists anywhere in the world, that if we follow politicians too much and what politicians are doing and not doing, we really miss the big picture, because the big picture and the future of Africa lies not with a few politicians who have missed the way, with millions of ordinary Africans who are trying to eke out a living.
Okay, thank you very much, Brahima. I'm afraid you're going to have to speak also for,
sure.
not only for Burkina, but also perhaps for the French West Africa.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you see the situation in, from sort of where you stand from Radio Burkina and from the sub-region?
I think I'll speak on two perspectives. First, as a journalist of Radio Burkina, which is a state-owned, and as a correspondent for AP, IRIN, and IPS.
Yeah.
So, well, the main news today in West Africa is high rising food costs. It's the big issue today. And, we have a lot of foreign journalists coming on the field to see the violence and everything going on. So the main question is, how do we, portray this news ourselves in our national radio? What we are trying to do is to go on the ground, talk to the people who are feeling the issue, who are feeling the heat of this high rising costs, and report on them, and then try to see what the alternative the government can look for to find a sustainable issue, because it's not a small problem that it can solve by tomorrow or in a week. It's going to take a long time to change the policies. You've seen that the FAO is saying that we must eat what we grow, and we must grow what we eat. And this is something that some of our countries started long ago, but they were forced to stop because of the structural adjustment programs with the IMF and the World Bank. So that means the journalists should go and look for the best stories and to help the government find a hard solution to new solutions and sustainable ones to this problem. As a correspondent for international news agencies like the AP, I would say, well, I know that's not easy always to place a good story. I remember, I'm not going to name the agency, but I have a good story, to tell you. Recently, I went to Cote d'Ivoire, across the border between Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina, to write a story on meningitis. When I came back, I sent a story to one of the news agencies, and one of the editors, she changed the story and she put some quotes where she shouldn't have put them to make the story very negative. And then, we have the internet. And then when they read the news in Cote d'Ivoire, I got feedback that the minister was not happy. And the bad thing is that the Director General of Health has been sacked because of the story. So that was very sad, and I called the journalist and the boss. I said, "No, this is not nice. You shouldn't do that. I never quoted this one. He never said that, and you made a story." So they changed the story online, but the bad thing has been done. So it's not always easy to place a story. There are so many things we can say about the issue. But we African journalists, and we have to work with our authorities to find financial means to make good productions, so that we can produce good stories for our populations. And then for that we need the help of our authorities also, because if they try to control too much the news agencies or the radio stations or television stations, we cannot have good story to feed the population. So they must allow you to have good production also with good policies.
Great, thank you, Ibrahim. Let me just ask, between the three of you, and then we shall open it up. What you see on, everybody these days has sort of international television coming into their various capitals and into homes. What do you see on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, sort of France 24? Do you recognize these as, when it's reporting about Africa, do you recognize these as the important stories or the key stories as you would have seen them? Or is it a different, do you see it differently, or would you have done it differently?
I think back to 1994, when possibly the world's media was in South Africa as our Uhuru election happened. And I suppose the key difference is that we have to stay for the process. We have to watch the development of democracy, which is inevitably a more boring story, if you like, but a more fundamentally important one. then 94. So of course you're seeing differences. I'm interested in how Al Jazeera is forcing a look at the South, how it's keeping the Millennium Development Goals top of mind. I like Inside Africa and some of the Africa-specific programs on the global networks, which I think do try and provide a bit of a different perspective.
I couldn't agree less with the point Farrell has made. I have just tried, now this is not scientific, but I have just tried in moving around from office to office, and I do move around offices a lot, to ask myself, what are people watching? What are people listening to? What are people reading? And well, with due respect to all the great international channels that you have here in Europe, I think it might interest us to know, and this came to me as a pleasant surprise, that a lot of people are tuning into Mnet to watch what you call the African magic, and to see how ordinary Africans are living their lives, and it's a huge hit now amongst in many homes, and people are tuning to CNBC to get a hang of what is happening, and quite interestingly to Al Jazeera. Now, that's neither here nor there, but I'm just stating the facts, and as I said earlier, it doesn't take away anything from the work that the other great international channels are doing, but it probably gives you a sense of how people are responding. And now there is an opportunity in Nigeria where we already have 38 going to 40 million mobile phones. People are probably very soon going to be able to watch television on their mobile phones. Now, what will they be watching? What will they be listening to? Your guess is as good as mine.
I think it's this week, if we leave Caroline. From Monday is when they'll be able to watch television. Right, okay, so I think from Monday they'll be able to watch television on their mobiles in Nigeria. But what about this thing? I mean, one of the things that comes up is that there's this talk of Africa. But what I did say is that it's a diverse continent.
Absolutely.
What do you mean when you speak? I mean, do you recognize this sort of monolithic sort of thing of Africa? And, in terms of when you're working on the continent, I mean, do you see yourselves as African journalists, or do you see yourself as South African, Nigeria, and dealing with those stories that are in your purview, in your countries, in your societies? Do you see what I mean? So that you look at Africa, I mean, do we say, I'm going to Europe? Or do we look at the European stories? I don't know. Maybe we do, but we don't say American stories, meaning Brazil. And or do we? I don't know. I mean, do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I would say the diversity is there, but all in all, you must acknowledge that when we look at this African news or this thing, we found a ground where you see everything together. There is some culture we share together. That's why we sometimes, when people say in Africa we have with African movie, you know that whether the movie is from Nigeria or from Kenya or Zimbabwe and South Africa, you find some common ground where you agree on some of the issues. And then we have the same issue, development, and we have the same challenges we are facing. And I want to add something in West Africa to say that the landscape has been changing. We have Africable, which just came and which is started in Mali, which is doing a good job to change the whole system. The good thing is that we have a lot of graduates that are coming. We're now investing in Africa, in the media. So one of the good things, the new things is Africable. They are based in Mali, but what they do is that they are getting the news from all the Francophone countries, and they show them every day. And then people tune to them. If you don't need a decoder, you just tune in, and then you can watch the news from the other countries. You can watch some cultural stuff and a lot of productions from the Francophone countries. And this is new. And if you go to Burkina, to Cote d'Ivoire, to Mali, you can see a lot of things that people are sharing together in this Africable. So it's coming slowly, but yeah, it's coming.
So in other words, Africa is speaking to itself, within its own sort of sub-region.
Yes, just a very brief and quick intervention. But that's not to suggest that there is an African standard of journalism different from what the rest of the world is doing. I just thought I should make that point, because we talk about this very frequently in the newsroom, that if you want to compete these days, you're not just a local newspaper competing against yourself. If you really want to be the best, then you must see yourself as competing against the rest of the world. We understand that perfectly. But we cannot also deny the fact that if you take the Nations Cup that just ended in Ghana, the 4 stadia that were built in Ghana were built by Chinese companies. And eventually the news will have to follow the money, or the money will follow the news, whichever way it goes. But I'm just saying that there are realities that are changing. There's a changing landscape that we must all be aware of and talk a lot more about.
All right, thank you. I mean, you've heard some of the contributions of those on the panel. I think I need to bring all of you in, and if does anybody have any points to make at this stage?
So it looks like Manchester United, the match is taken away. I hope not.
You're not allowed to mention that. You're not allowed to mention that. There's a gentleman here. I think he's going to have a mic too.
Hi, it's Damien West. You touched on it slightly, but how do you see the relationship between African countries and Europe? Because obviously living in Europe, we have a perspective on how we see our relationship with Africa. And the second point of that is, what would be your one wish of of European countries in terms of their behaviour towards Africa?
I'll let each of them say. Do you want to take that?
Sure.
Because there'll be different perspectives.
Sure.
I
I think Europe's influence in Africa is in decline, and I think that's a very good thing. And if there's one wish, I suppose, in the European narrative of Africa, is to stop treating it as a country but as a continent. That's extremely complex, because I don't think you see coverage of Africa coverage of Europe that sounds like it does of Africa, which seems, when you look at a Kenya or a Zimbabwe, think, oh God, there goes another one, basket case. But actually it's not true, because if I was to apply that logic and assume that, say, the French president's peccadillos explained a lot of where Germany would go, it's just not it's not terribly scientific. So I think in a nutshell, it's been a period of declining influence, and Zimbabwe is a symbol of that. But it's a good thing. You see it also in the attempt to sign the EPAs, not terribly successful. And I do think we need to start looking at India and China in fundamental ways, not see them as the new perils or the new colonial powers, but engage them on our own terms and towards our own ends, looking back, though, at what happened in the colonial period.
Yeah. I think there are 2 very good examples. Last week, I think a big company, mining company in Zaire, DRC, they took more than 80% of the shares that were owned for a long time ago by a Belgian company. This is one of the examples. The second example is Angola, where they are now trying to manage the oil themselves. And another example is Niger. So that tells that the Europeans' influence is now is declining, and many countries are now trying to lead their own business themselves. But they still need to cooperate, but not in the older ways where they were kind of condescending attitude from Europe. I think more and more people are not going to accept it, and they're not accepting it again.
Well, if I would just to deal briefly with that, I would say it's fair to expect that it's a question of context. I think that's what it's all about. Nobody is saying that Africans should be in denial of what is happening or tolerate tyrants in power, or that if we have such tyrants, we should not face up to them and deal with those issues. But we're saying, as Ferry said at the beginning, that if you're looking at one election that didn't go well, you also look at another one that went well.
Sure.
And you also recognize in reporting all of this that we're dealing really with context issues. And we're not dealing with just a whole a country, but we're dealing with a continent with its challenges and its difficulties and its prospects, of course.
Yeah, I think at the same time, as I said at the beginning, our officials should allow the local media to also report on some of the issues. If not, if they don't do that, the Western media will come and say whatever they say, and the people are going to listen to them. At home, we have a RFI, we have a BBC, FM, and VOA. We have all this media, and if there's a strike in my country, and you don't allow the national TV or radio or newspaper to cover it, but the foreign new media will do it, and then the people will tune them and listen to it very carefully. So you need to allow the local media, the state-owned media, to report on the main issues also.
So would you say that the Europe-stroke sort of Africa relationship, are you comfortable with the way sort of news organizations, say from Europe, are reporting on many of the African countries?
Well, let me try to illustrate that, if I may, with just one example. I said last year, when we came here last year, we were all very concerned, genuinely, I believe, about the outcome of the rather disastrous elections in Nigeria. And we all had a reason to be concerned about that. But the question is that the country continues after the elections. And we are trying to deal with the demons, post-election demons, you know, those court issues, and then the 8 years of Obasanjo. Now, I do not know how, what kind of coverage of that is coming across. But the point I'm just trying to make is that, well, of course we had elections, we had issues, but then the whole process of reporting how we are dealing with those issues, in my view, are just as important to journalists in Nigeria and in West Africa as they ought to interest journalists elsewhere. That's all.
Okay. Anybody else with any points to make? Okay, one here, and then the lady, and then the lady here.
My name is Mark Ashurst. Is that this the whole Africa-Europe dynamic is so complicated and contradictory and fraught with internal contradictions that I'd just like to sound a note of caution, if it's of any use. That yes, there are all these very important new influences, China and India, and that has to be a resource for Africa with lots of potential. And yes, in some ways, lots of aspects of the old colonial relationships are in demise. But Europe is still by far the most important continent to Africa, not just in terms of its trade, which dwarfs everything else, but also all the institutional history and all the other connections, difficult and problematic though it is. And I think you'd have had a really interesting time, Farron, if you'd been here when Jacob Zuma was here.
Really?
Because he's got an extraordinarily generous, excited, kind coverage, which in some ways I found quite disturbing. Because there was a kind of subtext in this message, in a lot of the coverage, that something about Jacob Zuma as an uneducated polygamist, as a traditionalist, was somehow a more authentic kind of African than the kinds of people who have recently been leaders of the ANC. And that was a real subtext to what was written, and it wasn't just coming from the right, it was coming in all the newspapers, that this idea that somehow Jacob Zuma embodies something which is really genuine. And it's a very short step from that to finding excuses for the rest of the world, and particularly people in Europe, not to take Africa seriously and not to engage with Africans really seriously. And the big change in the last 10 years or so has been trying to engage with issues like trade, and you mentioned the EPAs and all those things, on equal terms, and have a kind of more rigorous debate which is more practical and less fanciful and leaves some of the baggage behind. And I actually think a lot of those gains are in jeopardy, and you're not going to find a lot of journalists, Western journalists, who have that appetite or the time or the resources to look really seriously into what these issues mean for Africa. So African journalists are going to have to set the agenda and the pace and do what they can to try and define the terms of engagement between Africa and Europe. So, you know, tempting though it is to feel that all of that can be put behind us, it's actually really important to engage with Europe as much as you can, because there are plenty of quite reactionary forces here who don't really want to be honest.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Just before I come to the lady at the back, I mean, does anybody want to sort of respond to that? No.
It's safe to say I find the Zuma charm offensive, and sure, he's a nice, personable man. I can understand why that would happen, but let's not forget that this is the guy facing corruption and racketeering charges in August, and somehow it says to me that the standard for governance in Africa is a little bit lower, that you cannot ask those tough questions, or perhaps they were asked.
They were.
I'd love to go and look back at the press here, because yes, he is a lovely man, and yes, South Africa needs a more touchy-feely leader right now after our years of a kind of distant leader who told us what to do and what to think. We need somebody who is engaging, willing to listen again, take us back to the Madiba years. But I, for the life of me, can't get over this corruption trial and believe that we need to first do that before he even comes within seeing distance of the presidency. And in fact, what might happen in our country now is that come August, when his trial is on, he may very well be on this election stumps while also going to court at the same time. Mark, that's quite worrying.
All right. There's a lady at the back. Yeah. Yeah.
My name's Nicholas Spur. I talk from really only a South African experience, but I have two questions and I would like to hear from everyone really. The first is around the relationship between journalists and people in power and players on the kind of national and regional stage. Because my experience as a freelance journalist is that it's incredibly difficult to ask those tough questions and to even get people to talk to me. And even when I've been doing like a profile feature, which is a puff piece on a national leader, and it's been accepted on commission by a UK national publication, it's really hard to get an interview. And I was just wondering if that experience is something that you're finding, and if that space for asking those tough questions is getting tighter, or it's. I mean, I think certainly in the South African context, the government has been less and less willing to talk to the press on tough issues over recent years, and I would like to hear your comment. And then my second question is really around resources available for investigative reporting, because I see so many really good journalists and good publications who work on shoestring budgets and don't have particularly great training available for journalists. And just in the kind of African context, what's your thoughts about that?
All right. Should I ask? Let's see. Okay, I'll ask Azu to sort of kick us off, because he comes from a country where presidents
that's
are
quite
always
interesting, because I was just sharing with my colleagues over dinner last night an encounter that I had with the former president. I'll just be quick with that. We had gone to, just to illustrate the point you made about the challenges that we face as journalists, speaking to power, so to speak. And there were 5 of us in the room, and one of us had asked President Obasanjo the question. At that time, in 2003, there was a state in the eastern part of Nigeria that was in crisis, and some power broker had actually kidnapped the sitting governor, and the government and everybody seemed totally helpless. So one of my colleagues asked President Obasanjo the simple question, said, "Who is this guy?" And he just cleared his throat and said, "Well, he was nice party guy who helped us to win the elections in 2003. And then I said to him, "Is that all you are going to say about him? Surely you must have a lot more to say about." And then he stood up and almost, was almost like charging at me. And of course, I kept my cool. And when he sat down and he had calmed down, I repeated the question. I said, "Well, Mr. President, you have not answered my question." That was the end of the interview, not to lengthen a short story. So we do confront these issues from time to time, but and I'm just not talking about a personal heroic story. There are hundreds of journalists, I believe, who still, in spite of those challenges, get around those challenges somehow and do ask the tough questions. The answers may not always be forthcoming, but there have been a few pieces, in spite of stonewalling by officialese, that finally led to investigations. And then I remember the fall of the speaker. The former speaker in 2001 was as a result of some journalistic piece done by the news magazine. So we do have from time to time, in spite of the challenges that we face, people putting up a brave fight and still getting answers to very tough questions or getting things sorted out. Very quickly on the second one about resources. That is a major problem, the resource problem. But I think the greatest resource, and again it's a matter that we discuss from time to time in the newsroom, is the mind. It's okay. I mean, you may not do the same great piece of journalistic work as somebody in another part of the world with a lot of resources, but with a little creative effort sometimes, you may be able to achieve a lot. And we have seen a bit of that in the judging that we have done so far for the CNN Multi-Choice African Journalist of the Year. Sometimes I think it's more a problem of the attitude of the mind than of physical resource. I'd like you to stop at that.
Yeah, I think the point is clear for those working for the public media in our countries, where you have to have a membership, a membership card of the ruling party. If you're working for the media, it's expected that you follow the ruling party and everything. But the situation is changing. You have new journalists coming. You have the influence of this international media around that makes things easy for the government to control and manipulate the news as they used to do before. So that one is also changing. And as a senior reporter, for instance, in my radio station, what I do is to bring the young journalists in my room, my office, and then teach them another lesson. I tell them to try to balance the news, and it works. It's changing slowly, but it's going to take time. But things are changing. As for the stories, the means, the financial means, again, we have some good entries with not enough funds, but we have some good entries for this CNN Multi-Choice Award. That means that some people can do a very good job. It's risky, they are taking a lot of risk, but they do it, and it's a good thing.
Okay, I mean, I'm just Ferial. I mean, you come from a country where your leader is quite keen on the media.
No.
Sorry, I'm just wondering. Maybe.
Just to answer you at the back, so I'm not so sure that delivered access to information is great. And I don't know who of you have had the privilege of listening to Not So Bright Matonga trying to explain away the Zimbabwean election results.
So
it's not. Sometimes it's better not to have the access, actually. And with Zuma at the moment, he's not speaking to 3 newspapers, but I do believe that makes us that much sharper at finding the stories, the real stories. I'm not big on easy access or too much delivered information, but that's just because of the paper I'm from.
I'm reminded that I think today one of our colleagues were watching the entries, and our colleague Kim Nogard, who's the CNN bureau chief, Johannesburg, sort of looked at one of the stories and said, "That shows you don't need huge resources to make a good story." And I mean, Kim, you recall that this afternoon?
No, I think we found that in a lot of the stories.
Yes.
It's not very.
Sorry.
No, I was just saying, I think a lot of stories we've seen the last couple of days, it's not all the bells and whistles we in the big foreign media have. It's just a tape recorder. It's just a circumcision story. It's really all you need to tell a great story.
Okay.
I think technology is also helping a lot.
There is a growth in technology. Okay, yes, listen. Okay, the gentleman. Let me go to that gentleman first, and then there. Put his hand up.
Hi. I've often wondered whether or not it actually matters what these Western media is reporting about Africa. But after sort of living here for a long time, I've sort of come to the conclusion that if Europe wants to encode a different relationship, it does actually need to portray Africa in a more balanced way. And when you said, when you were sort of addressing the same point, you're not sure whether it actually matters. I also think that in terms of trade, it does matter what the average person thinks of Africa. If he's going to set up a business and is going to be thinking, where are the possibilities for me to explore new opportunities in terms of trade and investment? And he's not going to look at Africa if everything he hears is negative. This is not to say that you shouldn't report the negative stuff. It's just the context, as you say, and the balance of the stories. The question I have is, do you as African journalists feel the need to respond when you read a story that you feel is been written particularly negatively, when it probably doesn't represent the actual situation? And if you do, what do you actually do, and how do you actually respond?
Good case in this one.
Wow. Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Brian is very keen on.
Yeah, I have a good
taking
case in this one. When the avian flu,
Yeah.
what we call, appeared in Nigeria for the first time, I was still in the U.S. Was listening to Radio France International, and then they were broadcasting the news that there were some cases of avian flu in Nigeria. Here is what the journalist said. Well, Nigeria, the first case appeared. Nigeria, there is corruption. Corruption AIDS, so it's going to spill over because the borders are not. Oh my God, I've been traveling through Europe for the past 10 years. I traveled a lot in Europe, and there's no border. You know, I took a train from Paris. I go to Belgium. So what's the link between AIDS, avian flu, and corruption? So I went to my computer. I went to the site, the RFI site, and I sent an email. So no, this is the way you should portray things. You know, I know you can cover all the regions, but it's not fair. That's one of the things I did, for instance, to tell the people that it's not fair. There's no link between the issues. There are so many things like that we can say. So the problem is that some of our people are not media literate. You know what I mean? You know, they listen to the news. They don't know what is true and what's not true. What I call media literature. They can listen. That's the problem we have. They listen to the news. They just believe in it. That's the end of it. So for some of us who can react, there are several ways to do it. You can either send an email or do something differently at home that can show the other side of the story.
Okay, Azu, have you had?
Well, the need to respond. I have to be very careful here because there's a need to draw a line between advocacy and then just doing your job as a journalist. And I said about that, I mean, what we tried to do and the challenge that we set for ourselves is to ask ourselves a question as journalists in The Punch. Now, how are we in The Punch covering Africa? And what are the things that we are reporting about Africa? And what we did was to start a page. And so today, every day, there's a page on business in ECOWAS, you know, which deals not with the high-profile sort of things, but what ordinary people around the sub-region do on a day-to-day basis and how they survive, and businesses and things like that. Now, that, I don't know how you want to classify that, but that, in a way, is how we think probably we begin to, address the issue of contextual coverage of what is going on in the continent. That's important.
Have you ever had to write a nasty letter to respond?
No, but that's because I think Binyavanga Wainaina did it so beautifully when he wrote about how to write about Africa. Always go for the apricot sun dipping into the sunset and adopt the somber, pathetic tone of pity. Anyway, you've got to read it, it's in Granta. But what we're trying to do at our paper is start something called the African Voices series, which is an effort to start south to north flows of opinion into the opinion and hopefully the features pages of major newspapers on our continent and more broadly than that. Tough task because here sits Ms. Gugu Moyo in London and she really needs to be a columnist for that service. But often our best brains are in the north and I think it is about getting them back onto the continent is the bigger political picture to make something like that work really well. Hint, hint.
I don't think there was a hint. There was a hit over the head.
Sorry.
for Gugu, sorry, gentleman over here.
You talked about there being large quality improvements in production in all media in Africa for the past decade. Who's financing that? Is it domestic or foreign business, private or public? And does that hold any implications for press independence?
Let's start with you. Ferrio's, I mean, you can talk about your ownership,
Sure.
in terms of your paper and what you're saying. across the globe.
Our paper was a joint venture with The Guardian, which owned it about half-half, and it never made, it wasn't break even for about 20 years until a Zimbabwean man took it over, and now it's suddenly on the path to the good times. And I think across our continent, many of my colleagues can speak about that. I do think it's African entrepreneurs, publishers like Edward Boateng over here, who I hope will speak, who's behind this flourishing of ideas and of media.
Just to add quickly that technology too has made it slightly easier to deal with. I know that in the past, if you wanted to to start a newspaper would cost an arm and a leg. And but right now, you can just set up a website and talk to the continent and talk to the rest of the world just right in your newsroom. So that's a very important point. And that's, as I said earlier, we moved in the past 5 years from less than 400,000 lines, mobile phone lines, to about 40 million. That's quite huge.
Yeah, the other thing is that even in public media are getting a lot of money from advertising, so they are able to fund some productions, radio and television or print.
We've got somebody here in Edward who's actually sort of one of those who's, apart from starting the CNN Africa Journalists of the Year and Multi-Choice competition, is actually one of those who's founded media in Africa. Edward, I don't know if you want to comment on what made you do it, apart from making millions of dollars. It will be interesting because you have somebody who's actually been doing it.
When you say I founded media, then what do you mean? Because I didn't found
the general was like, who is starting this new media on the African continent? Who's funding it? So.
The last 10, 15 years, I've seen a lot of private ownership, private entry into media. I mean, hitherto when I joined CNN in the 90s, you only had state media, really not public broadcasters, but state media. But today, in a lot of African countries, by a few examples, media is being driven from the private sector. And therefore, there is advertising revenue. As you said, there is technology. And therefore, there is a lot of cooperation across borders and even with international media. So I think the revenues are driving up the programming quality. I mean, if you look at Multi-Choice, for instance, when they started, most of their programs were international programs. But today, most of their driver programs, like for instance, are African-produced programs, and these are all paid for sometimes through sponsorship. So it's really the private sector participation, and that's growing as well.
Okay. Anybody else wanted to make a? Okay, I'll take the gentleman there first, and then we'll move to that side of the room.
Hi, James Dyson. I just have a question regarding going back to that subject of resources. Here in the West, we have an increasing dependence on the large agencies to provide news to ourselves. Now, I would imagine that might well be the case for you guys in Africa as well, in different African countries. If you want to learn about what's happening in your neighboring African countries, you probably have to depend on a news agency in London or Paris. How can you get around that? When we were talking earlier about Europe being perhaps less important in that particular area, given that the Chinese news agency is not terribly reliable either, what solutions are there? Perhaps the internet.
Asu, do you want to take that first, if I ask for him?
Right, fine. The issue of, I do agree with you. How do we get our news about Europe? That's a bit difficult. But right now we still will rely largely on the big Western wire services for news, but also the cost of travel. Fortunately, today is a lot cheaper than it was many years ago. So. If you really do want to get an important story, and I take the American elections, for example, what it will cost today to send a reporter from Nigeria to cover the American elections, it's not what it would have cost many years ago, because flights are cheaper and all of that. So where we find it extremely important, we do send people out to do the actual coverage, but otherwise we still do depend on major wire services.
I'm thinking particularly within Africa.
Within Africa, yes, we do that too within Africa. The News Agency of Nigeria, for example, has a wide network, and we depend a lot on News Agency of Nigeria to get our news from Africa, and from parts of Nigeria where we cannot have physical presence because of cost.
Is that the same?
Yeah, it's the same. We still rely on the news agency, but now we have the internet, and then you can go online and read the newspapers. But if you cannot go online, some of the newspapers and radio stations are trying to collaborate with some others in the other countries, so that they can share the news, and if there is an important event, they can send them news without a fee, but because most of them don't have a means to pay for that.
Okay, fair enough, and then Sophie will come in.
Sophie first.
Okay, Sophie? You want to make a contribution to that? Yeah, done. So we get a mic too.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted maybe to add to this. In terms of sources, of course, yes, there are the major wire services, international, but also there's been a generation of African wire services. We've had the Pana News Agency created by the States at some point. Now there's a new generation created again by some private entrepreneurs, for example, APA News. And this comes also from, I think, a political consciousness of African journalists, or just Africans, now having a sense that they need to look at the continent information-wise, news-wise. They need to have really the perspective, so they can just limit themselves to their countries. And this is also true for very young journalists who, thanks to this industry, as I call it, of conferences, many of them have been traveling, meeting, so they have a sense of each other. And what I hear more and more from press reviews is some of them trying to pick the newspapers from other countries, colleagues from other countries, and giving a sense of the region or the continent, so that they can have a larger view. I don't know if I'm giving you a sense of what's happening. It's really a dynamic from the international wire news to they're using the internet in the best possible way. So I think it's really a deep trend that is coming. Thank you.
Okay, if you want anything to add in? No. There was a gentleman there, and then there. And then we'll make a few more other points.
Hi there. In a similar vein, I guess, from the point of view of a complete beginner, and this is open to anyone who wants to answer, which online sources would you recommend in your respective countries for us to look at to get news? Because I honestly
Great. Online sources.
Which are the online sources?
Well, anything we have access to.
Yes.
Does
anybody want to
as a matter of fact, just to add, and this you might find this useful, there is a site called SaharaReporters.com. Now, Sahara Reporters, I found it extremely useful. It was started by a Nigerian who's based in the US. And a lot of the stuff that some of us back home may not even have the courage to start, the guy does a great job of it, and we just jump on it. So you'll find that extremely useful. SaharaReporters.com. A lot of the news about corruption and what is being done and who's hiding what under the carpet and all of that. That we get a lot from that, and then once we get from that, we do our cross-checking, and then we publish. But a number of occasions I've found their stories extremely useful.
Yeah, I think also there is the new UN agency, IRIN.
IRIN.
Yeah, IRIN. They have a good database for people who can go there and get some balanced news, different from the other mainstream agencies.
Was that
APA News? APA News, yeah.
APA News.
AllAfrica.com.
Yeah, AllAfrica.com.
AllAfrica.com.
Yeah, IRIN is IRIN is IRIN. IRIN. Yeah, IRIN. IRIN. Yeah. Thank you. APA News and also AllAfrica.com.
Yeah. So there's a range source that you can search. Sorry. MNG. Yes, of course. We get that way. So there's a gentleman just behind you, Megan.
Yeah, my name is Sonny Daniel. While here in London, we come across people who think that in Africa, editors and reporters, they like to sit on stories. It's either they kill such stories or they engage in self-censorship. And then when the issue of Kenya came up, the reportage itself was largely a demonstration of censorship in the sense that some Kenyan reporters did not mention the names of those who masterminded the killings and the victims. And And they explained that that was expedient in the sense that it helped to bring down the escalation of the violence, destruction of lives and property. But then, if you look at the way the Western media reported the naming of a teddy bear, Muhammad, in Sudan, which immediately sparked a lot of trouble, which, if not well handled, could have led to the death of that woman. Now, there is this question that keeps coming. To what extent do we publish, and that appears jargon that drives some people to publish everything? It's good that we have some top-ranking journalists sitting there, and they may provide an answer. To what extent should we go in publishing and being down? Is there any lesson we can learn from the reportage of the Kenyan crisis?
I was going to, we'll come to sort of the Kenyan issue, but in terms of the, publishing and being down, very is there a point at which?
I worry about the question because even within the African Editors Forum, there's this constant tension between the imperative to build and the imperative to keep power on its toes. And I don't ever think that they should become mutually exclusive things, not at all. We need to be guided. I'm guided by our constitution in our country, which is very clear on the role of journalism and on the basic rights which it sets. So I never ever feel that conflict. In Kenya, I can certainly, I don't agree with, but I understand which the editor took. But I think that there are evils we don't speak about often enough. And that's the dangers lead to censorship. That all said, though, today we're looking through the potential awardees for the Free Awards, the Free Press Africa Awards. And in this content that makes my blood boil in my history of journalists who've been jailed for 8 years, entire groups of generations of young journalists who sit in jail. So I don't think self-censorship is a content. There is a great, for one national interest is a public interest.
Yeah, I don't think it's, you cannot say that all editors in Africa, you to be responsible when you are dealing with it. This is the rules. So saying kill a story, self-censorship doesn't happen everywhere, So,
publish and be damned. Well, it's a nice phrase, but quite frankly, we have a constitution that guides us, and there are ethical codes that we must follow. But that is not to deny, because sometimes, and I have been around Africa a bit, you find a real reason. There's a lot that in Africa who do. We have to keep the spotlight on them until the continent is completely free and is of official sense. But you also across from time to time people who are on so the government that story. The land for that is at the level that you have.